Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Whitaker from the Knowledge Transfer Network, and he's going to be talking about how climate data is used in the broader world.
Thank you very much. I want to give you a little bit of background as to what I do, because that might help reference the comments that I make. I've spent 25 plus years in financial services, and I've spent the last 15 to 20 of those with a number of different functions looking at risk, particularly looking at risk and trying to interact with academia. Maybe that sounds a slightly strange thing to say, but if you're in business, you don't find it that easy to necessarily to extract value from the academic world. And I can say that, I think, with some authority coming from that environment. If, however, you're in academia, you might actually find that you have the same sort of problem. Of course, you might not care because your research might be, or your goals might be just to pursue excellence in research and doing some interesting things. And so if you don't care, then you either might want to just sort of do some emails or leave, because I'm going to be talking about how you can use your information to benefit the business community and financial services in particular, and try and explain how financial services sees what you're doing and what it needs from you and where it may need some additional help. So if that's of interest, then for 20-25 minutes, because that's roughly what I'm going to talk for, and allow time for questions if you wish, that's what I'm going to try and focus on a little bit. And I need to just explain a little bit about who I work for. I'm a director of the Financial Services Knowledge Transfer Network, which is partly funded by, or mostly funded by, the Technology Strategy Board, partly funded by ESRC, and actually we do quite a bit of work with NERC too. And that's a sort of mission statement up on the screen about what we try and do. If you try and simplify that a little bit, what it boils down to is we find problems from the business community, and we try and find solutions from academia. I mean, at the sort of simplest level, that's what it boils down to. That can take the shape and form of many different things. We try and place some students, we try and provide some data. We certainly try and take papers written from the academic community and try to extract from that information, algorithms, models that we can use in financial services. And by and large, I think that's it's a good thing to do. It's certainly an interesting thing to do. And so that's a sort of little bit of background to me and the KTN and what we do, which hopefully will inform a little bit about what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what exactly do financial services want from climatologists, from people like you. Specifically, what does uncertainty mean in that sort of context? Practically, how does financial services deal with uncertainty? And I know that I'm talking to a group of experts, so I'd have to at least confess that I'm very happy to take questions during or after the presentation. If they're a little bit too complex for me, I might struggle, because I don't have the same depth of background that you do. So just please be gentle if you've got some nasty technical questions, and I'll do my best to make the talk clear for you. So that's the bit about the agenda. So does what your science teach us, does it really matter? Well, this is a fairly simple graph of the number of catastrophic events that we've experienced since about 1970 till the current day. And regardless of climate change, or possibly as an early signal of climate change, as I'm sure you all know that there's been an increase, and it's been going up, and that causes problems, especially when you combine that with increasing populations and the sighting of those sort of populations. And if you look at the text on the side, so it makes it quite clear that these are just a number of events that have occurred in the last since 1970. But in 2010, current estimates are about $222 billion of losses, which is sort of 3 times what we experienced last year. So there's a meaningful number of loss out there that we're having to deal with, society's having to deal with. And the insurance and reinsurance industry in particular, probably more so than other areas of financial services, has to find a way of sort of quantifying. So what you do and the research you're doing is really, really important for how we run our businesses. I picked out a study that the Association of British Insurers had done, it was a couple of years ago now, They came up with these numbers that says that this is a direct quote, by 2050 the annual cost of weather claims will double to 3.3 billion euros. Will double to 3.3 billion euros. I sort of put that down because I thought that's an interesting number, and I didn't really read it that closely until after I'd actually copied it into PowerPoint. And then I looked at it a bit more and I sort of thought, that's a really, really strong statement. Will double, and actually part of what I think the message I'm going to try and give you today is, I'm afraid to say, even though that comes from an insurance body, it's not really very helpful. It's not very helpful because I don't really know how they quantify any uncertainty within that will, and it wasn't entirely clear where they got some of those numbers from. So in insurance, so we think we've got a big issue because we've got increasing numbers of events. Those events apparently are going to go up, and the ABI have got those numbers from. Some of you in this room may have contributed towards the studies that the ABI has got. But ultimately, uncertainty is the prime driver behind pricing for insurance in particular. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So fundamentally, everything that you're doing not only has a societal benefit, but has a really important role for financial services. So what is it that people in financial services want to know the answer to? Really sort of basic level. What are the questions they need to answer? Well, I've got a list here, and this is perhaps this is the sort of top whatever it is, 5 or so, that everybody needs to know. And of course, within that encapsulates a whole range of other problems there. But changing frequency and severity of extratropical cyclones and tropical cyclones is just a huge issue. And clearly there's a massive academic focus on all of those sort of things, but maybe I don't know if you'd be surprised or not surprised. I don't think I know enough about your how you'd view this, but we just can't get enough handle on this. We just don't really understand enough about it. And the trouble is that perhaps that the research isn't out there. It's either too much, or it's not in the right sort of format, or it's conflicting. And we can't get enough of a steer about where we should go to try and get the right answer, and whether there's an argument between Professor A and Professor B. So how do we actually make a judgment about how we use those sort of conflicting sort of conversations? Correlation is a sort of massive issue too, and really, again, any large economic area you can think about, we're concerned about the repercussions of that. So again, particularly, there's been some interesting research looking at clustering of hurricanes coming in through the Gulf of Mexico. It's as you can imagine, it makes a huge, significant impact. If we've got one hurricane barreling into the Gulf of Mexico about to hit the Texas coast, if we assume that there's a Poisson frequency of the next one appearing, or it isn't because there's a correlation, that's going to massively change not only the impact to that part of the United States, but also the impact to the pricing models that we use to make judgments about insurance risk and insurance price. There's quite a lot of work being done looking at landfalling hurricanes and particular and frequency of events in various basins around the world. Again, particularly useful for insurance and reinsurance. And we do often get sort of, in theory, useful information on skill levels of those predictions. But we also get a bit confused because the skill levels aren't done on the same sort of basis. So we sort of get something that says, well, here's my prediction for, again, for perhaps hurricanes in the Atlantic, and the answer is going to be X number, plus or minus, and the skill levels are sort of Y, and then somebody else does exactly the same thing and sort of seems to show similar sort of skill levels, and they're all really good. But again, it doesn't necessarily seem to help if you haven't really done enough work into understanding the basis of those skill levels. Then actually you might be sort of slightly bamboozled if you're not technical enough to be able to understand it. So that causes a bit of a problem occasionally. Rainfall and flood, and to a degree drought, are also sort of massive issues. And I think in a way, I think we've seen perhaps more beneficial activity in some of the research that we've been able to get hold of in this area than we have for some others. And And it's probably because I think we've seen some greater certainty in the results available to us for looking at flood, particularly in Northern Europe, than we have for various types of sort of windstorm. But again, it's a sort of massive interest and very, very interesting. And then the last thing, which I briefly made the point before, but the uncertainty around all these numbers is just hugely important. And I suppose that there are times when sort of people say to me, well, you must be massively interested in climate change being in the insurance industry, because the impact could be so hugely significant. And on a day that sort of, depending on who it is and the sort of time of the week, sometimes the answer I might give is, well, not really, no, which usually produces the predictable reaction of sort of shock. But the reason is because if the uncertainty is so large and the time period being analysed is quite lengthy, 2020, 30, 50, then for a business that renews itself on an annual basis, that can reprice on an annual basis, it's not really going to be of a significant interest when you're either again got too much uncertainty or you're looking out too long. So the short answer is, when there is information that can sort of change near-term impact and reduce uncertainty, then we're extremely interested. If it goes much beyond that, then it's sort of come back some other time, because at the moment it's probably not going to be of massive interest. I'm going to touch very briefly on banking and the asset management community. And both bank and asset management have slightly sort of quite similar sort of interests. And perhaps a key concern they're trying to understand is there an impact by sector or by class of business that climate change is going to produce for them? And both banks, when they're giving out corporate loans, and asset managers, when they're trying to invest appropriately, need to make judgments about the type of businesses, how climate change is going to affect them generically, if that's possible to understand that, and particularly if there's sort of correlation between classes of business. I'm not entirely sure that there is enough information, other than very, very sort of simple, obvious ones. But there's not much information out there to be able to do that with climate change, and I may be wrong, but I think at the moment it's relatively sort of generic. Although I have had somebody in charge of risk at one of the big three banks who specifically come to actually do Goodman, the audience, and myself, and sort of said, "Can you tell me how climate change is going to affect my loan book?" And I did say to him, I thought that was probably one of the hardest questions I've probably been asked, because we're talking about a diverse group of asset classes, we're talking about a wide range of businesses in a wide range of countries, and we're talking about climate change, which is it's sort of hard to push into such a sort of simple question of that. But that's sort of why what we're trying to do in business is it's very challenging to take what you're trying to do and fit it into these sort of relatively narrow boxes. So the asset management I've sort of covered really, so that's more or less the same, but I just left it in there. But we know we care a lot about trying to understand the benefits that you can bring to us. And I just put this in here because it's sort of quite pertinent. This is a prize that has been instigated by Lloyd's of London, sort of the large UK-based insurance marketplace, which was trying to say, it sent out a note, in fact, to pretty much everybody, any university in the UK, saying, please submit papers of anything you think of interest to insurance, and we'd like to award a prize to the one that we think is most relevant. And they were separated into separate classes, and the overall winner was this chap whose name I can't remember now, actually, but the subject matter he's doing was global hydrology and uncertainty. And I thought it was just sort of interesting because I've possibly been painting a picture about how difficult it is to fit some of what you do into practical applications, but business is trying to sort of bridge the gap and is trying to sort of reach out to the academic community to say, please help us deal with some of these problems where you have interest, where you think it makes sense, and where it suits your sort of research. And this is an annual prize. So, you might just bear in mind that next year, if you're doing something, or your colleagues are doing something, do bear in mind that sometimes the research you may not be doing it for the purposes to benefit financial services, but it may well have that benefit, and there's a bit of money and possibly some benefit to enterprise next year. So I wanted to talk a little bit about price and a little bit about uncertainty, because I thought that if we explain a little bit better how we try and use the output of some of the models and the output of some of the research that you're doing, you might get a sense of therefore whether or not it makes whether or not there's something you're doing that can actually have some benefit, assuming that's what you want to do. So a sort of graph that I hope you've sort of seen components of before, but annual probability density, and here we got value at risk, and we're trying to assess really what the premium should be charged. And the premium is going to be divided up into a number of different components. There's an expected loss component, if you like, which is a sort of standard value at risk. But critically, of course, for natural catastrophes, we're concerned about the tail. And regulators demand that we look at a sort of 1 in 200 year event. So we've got a real problem with already, ignoring sort of impacts of climate change, we've got a huge problem just trying to understand the uncertainty at the tail. And that's before we even consider some fairly thorny issues like parameter risk, model risk, and of course this sort of unknown problem to the degree that it might exist in sort of climate. So that's a real challenge for us, because we really don't have the modeling techniques to be able to do as much of this as we really like. There aren't enough models available in the marketplace to be able to buy, and there's perhaps a side issue to that problem is, whilst you're doing a huge amount of work that could have a lot of benefit, there's a huge dislocation between the research that you publish and the availability of the science that you've got, and be able to push that into financial services. You almost certainly don't have the desire or wish to try and translate it into the sort of information that we need, and generally speaking, we don't have many people that have the desire to try and do that too. So a lot of it resides and stays with you, which is a shame. So, I think the other thing about this is all the models that we use so far are statistical models, pretty much statistical models, based on the best historical information that we've got available. The trouble is, of course, there's lots of problems with that. There's obviously problems about the adequacy of the historical information available, and that's poor in many cases. But it's particularly problematic if we're trying to incorporate some facet of climate change. So, we've got some real difficulties. Now, there are some generic attempts at the moment to try and factor in some elements of climate change. So what we tend to do is we tend to sort of just change either the frequency or the severity assumptions in the models that we use to calculate price by just sort of really, tweaking the dial a little bit here. At the moment, it's not terribly sophisticated, but it's not sophisticated mostly because we don't have enough information to be able to make some more granular adjustments to the models that we use for pricing. One thing we do try and do, and we don't do enough of this really, but one way that we try and get a better handle on the uncertainty, and I think this is pretty much replicated or comes from, in a way, perhaps what you do, but we try and run a large number of multiple models to try and get a handle on the uncertainty. And this is a loss exceedance curve, which we use as a standard way of pricing, in this particular case, in the insurance business. So you've got probability against loss, and the blue box here is a tranche of business that's been protected in the reinsurance marketplace. So it just happens to be that's what we're trying to look at, that's what we're trying to price. But clearly, with huge amounts of variability and uncertainty in the information that we've got, and considering different assumptions and different ways of looking at modeling, we're going to get a massive variance in some of these numbers. And not only do we have a problem in trying to understand what the uncertainty is and what the variance is, given sort of techniques, but we actually have a bit of a problem in how to deal with the uncertainty too, from a statistical or mathematical perspective. So, what do we try and do from the insurance industry perspective to try and better handle some of these sort of products and better handle some of this sort of problem? Well, we obviously trying to get as much data as we can. We try and get a handle on uncertainty, and we don't do very well, I don't think, there. If we could, we'd like to have confidence bounds around the sort of models we use to do that. In most cases, we don't have the tools to be able to do it in the way we'd like, or we don't have the information. There is actually a sort of restriction in the access to some of this information from some of the global providers that we buy this information from. We do use multiple models. That's one way we try and do it. And those of us that have some experience in this area in operating these in the business definitely try and encourage people to be sensible about the use of these models. So, this probably wouldn't be intuitive to you, but the situation that we get sort of one or two situations as a sort of slight generalization for people in the marketplace. We either get people that say, I don't trust these models, I don't understand the assumptions, I really don't understand where they come from, it's a black box, I don't want to use it, so they effectively find ways of not using it. Or we get people who say, well, I've been told by management to use these sort of models, so I'll just use it. And they completely just take everything as sort of gospel that comes out of the models. And of course that doesn't work either. But so we try and operate these models with caution and try and sort of get a sense check of, does this really make sense to what we're doing? And so we've got to be very careful. I mean, if we're only looking at, we don't only look at sort of catastrophic loss and environmental type of losses, we have to be able to deal with a bunch of other things too. So we just have to be very careful, and we have to sort of adapt, and we have to sort of think carefully about how we understand these sort of models. And I think perhaps, though, that's not a bad idea for those using models sort of generally. I sort of want to move, the next sections of talking a little bit about more uncertainty, and it's also talking about how we explain information about uncertainty, indeed about models in general. And this is a quote that I picked out, and I think we being business and possibly the general public have a real problem in understanding sometimes what we get given from the academic world, and I've probably got more experience than most people I deal with in the business environment, and probably most people I deal with in the general public. And I don't know if that sort of helps or not, but the trouble is I think we get some general statements like this one, indeed like the one from the ABI at the beginning, that sort of says, here is a simple statement trying to encapsulate what is an incredibly sort of complex world, trying to encapsulate some very, very complex models. And I think that it actually, instead of trying to give confidence to the public and business and consumers, it actually does the opposite, which doesn't really help. I then came across this article from, or this comment from Roger Pilker Jr., which I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have seen. But I thought it was interesting because what he's done is he's taken this analogy of using climate models or using models for weather forecasting, and the fact that the public in the United States have got used to being able to make a judgment about the uncertainty in those models because they've had enough experience to be able to observe them on a sort of day-to-day basis. The trouble is that we can't do that for large global circulation models that are driving some of the work that you're doing, amongst others. And how therefore do we get the validation? And as somebody that sits on the edge of your world and sort of one leg in your world and perhaps in one leg in society, I struggle with some of the demonstrations of verification and validation that have been put out there. And I know that this was discussed a little bit earlier in the week, but I don't think I'm going to hopefully cover too much of it. But I think that a couple of statements here that possibly slightly too straightforward and would need a bit of explanation, but I do think there's a situation that the global climate community have not been clear enough about the validation of these sort of models, and that's a real problem for people like me, because I'm actually trying to sell sort of the science behind this to try and get finance to be more robust, to make it more efficient, to make it keep making money rather than losing money, which should be good for everybody. And I get this thrown back in my face of, well, you said we could use this information, yet this has just been shown to be wrong, and the uncertainties weren't explained. I mean, they may not use that language, but they sort of come back to me and said, well, you told me I can use it, and now it's wrong. Now, sometimes it's because they're ignorant and they don't understand the uncertainty themselves, but sometimes it's because I think the global scientific community hasn't communicated as well as they could done about the information. There's also this issue, which I can't go into too much detail because I just don't have the knowledge to do so, but some of the data sets that are being used, there's a sort of circular sort of situation where the calibration and the evaluation are using the sort of same sort of data. Now that may be the sort of problem that you sort of face and you have much choice, but that doesn't seem to be in an ideal situation only. And then I was just talking over lunch about the fact that, well, you know, the whole IPCC process is sort of forcing the global community, the global scientific community in one particular area to do some pretty strange things. I mean, the timetables are very tight. You know, I don't believe there's another organization that's doing the same thing on the same sort of scale. It's all sort of probably following a political agenda. And you're sort of being pulled along to this sort of massive global effort in a way perhaps that you wouldn't design if you had the option to do so. I don't think I would design it that way. But that's producing some problems, and unfortunately, a byproduct of that problem is some reputational risk that I think the global scientific community is suffering as a result. And it's appearing in other areas too, but it's certainly appearing in the area of climate science. And then the last bullet point on this slide, which I sort of quite like from Lenny Smith, which is there are more ways to be wrong in 10 to the power of 6-dimensional space than there are ways to be right. And I don't know how many of you know Lenny. You know, he's quite a vocal statistician, but I sort of, at least I think that sort of resonates with me in the sense that, you know, don't let us forget, you probably know, but don't let us forget that actually we're talking about huge areas of uncertainty. And I think because you're doing fantastic leading edge research into a really interesting area, you forget sometimes when you're communicating with other people outside of the academic world about some of the issues about uncertainty, about what you're sort of doing, and really giving the sort of full picture. And if you don't do that, then we're going to possibly make mistakes in judgment because we're not given the full information by you, possibly because you assume we should know, and maybe we should, but we don't usually. So, a little bit on sort of where next might be a sensible place to go. And this isn't really in any particular order. I think the communication thing is a huge issue, and I'm sure, but to a degree, you can quite happily sit there and say, well, is this really your domain? Should you be concerned about the communication? Well, I don't know who should be concerned about the communication, but somebody should, and I think it needs to be better. And I was actually at a meeting in the Royal Society, I think it was about a year ago, when some eminent, another group of eminent global scientists were sitting around and we were all saying, well, you know, I don't understand why, you know, we've done the studies, we've published 6 papers, we've done this, I don't understand why the general public doesn't understand and doesn't get what we're doing. Well, and I didn't say at the time, but I felt like sort of saying, well, until you can get the sort of simple newspapers in the Sun in this country and you know, radio to understand these things, well, you're never going to understand it. You know, we don't operate in a rarefied atmosphere that doesn't involve the media and the television. You know, we've got to think about ways of doing this, and I think it's really, really important because, I mean, I might not even have a job if there was better communication. I spend a lot of my time trying to communicate between the sort of two communities. So I just think it's really, really important. I think the quantification uncertainty, the language around uncertainty is really important. I was at a conference yesterday and a bit of this morning looking at behavior and risk, and the sort of the longer I'm sort of in the risk business, the more I think behavior is just sort of woefully inadequately not being utilized, the knowledge of behavior and the knowledge of psychology and sociology are not being brought to play on risk. And it's so important. We have these biases that we all carry with us, and particularly when you're looking at extreme risk, particularly when you're looking at risks that are hard to quantify. And I would sort of encourage anyone that wants to try and create an understanding of what you're doing to think about the sort of behavioral aspects about how we understand these things. In terms of data being available, I did a project earlier at the beginning of this year for NERC, where we did a search of the 3 or 4 data centers run by NERC, And what we did is we took, we questioned about 17 people from financial services and said, what are the key issues and data that you want to get some information on? And then we searched for that data. And what we found is that there was quite a lot of gems of information there, but they were really hard to find, and they were hard to find for lots of different reasons. But and none of them are your fault, really. But what I would say is that, you know, if you've got information, you want to get it out there. We'd love to have a sort of methods to be able to sort of extract it. So if you've got papers you've written or research students are working with you and you think that there may be some benefit, and I'll come to it in a second, but basically just sort of, you know, send it to me and I'll I hope I don't get too many actually, because I might struggle if there's massive numbers, but we'll try and find a way of getting it out there. And I just thought I'd mention this on subject of NERC. I don't know if you're aware, but there is a competition that's going to be announced, which has been, money's been earmarked, but given the fact that you're sort of talking about a lot about uncertainty, looking at probability, uncertainty and risk, that's sort of being launched next. It's been announced already, but it's been launched next year. So, and I'm going to help a little bit in sort of trying to get that out in the market. But so if you're interested in that, you can look at their website for that, assuming you have the ability to and desire to want to be able to fund it. So I'm just going to, before a few questions, if you've got time, I'm just going to end with a sort of slide. So there are lots of challenges that we face in trying to utilize your information, and I hope I've given you a little bit of a flavor of that. But there are some things that we can do to help, and that's explicitly why the Technology Strategy Board, amongst others, are funding the knowledge transfer networks. So what we can do is a couple of things. Well, first of all, I hope we're going to be launching something that we're calling an open access catastrophe model framework. What that does is it's going to provide protocols to the academic community to say, if you have a hazard model that covers Northern Europe for windstorm, you can license it to the financial community. Here are the protocols you need. You just sort of pass it to us. It therefore fits into this sort of architecture, generic architecture that has all insurance and reinsurance conditions in that they need to be able to run this. And as I say, you can license it if you felt so. You can just sort of give it, of course. But it would allow, I think, we hope it will allow the academic world to be able to give value to the financial services sector in a way that's been harder to do in the past. So that's one thing that we're doing, I hope. You know, if you've got research you're doing you think might have interest, you can just send me an email and I'll try and answer the question when it does. I'll try and find ways of applying it. I might be able to find some companies. I'm always a bit nervous about putting things up there saying helping raising finance, because it's not as easy as, you all know, I'm sure, it's not as easy as you think, but we can occasionally get finance to support your research. If you have students who want to get some time working in financial services firms, we can find placements for you. Occasionally we can get data. So we can try and help bridge the gap. So I think there is a conclusion, perhaps, is I think that there's some challenges big challenges that we face in using your information. I think you face some challenges in how you communicate it, but we do have a forum that's trying to help and work and bridge the gap between the fantastic work that you do and hopefully mostly the useful profit-making work that financial services can do. So on that, I'm happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Just following up on that last point, I think there's a real challenge here in who funds these activities. So I ran for about 10 years a company that essentially sat between the research community and the business community. In fact, actually, some of the specific products we used to provide were for the reinsurance industry. There was quite a lot of effort that had to go in to produce it, to do the communication. It clearly wasn't scientific research. It was taking the scientific research and translating it to make it usable by your community. But the amount of money that your community was prepared to pay for those products was relatively small. Certainly not enough for any of us to retire to Bermuda. And consequently, in the end, we decided it was more effort than it was worth. To be perfectly honest.
Well, I mean,
so the question is who, there's clearly a need here, right? We're producing things in the academic community that might and you've got a need, and there's a gap that needs to be bridged between that. But who is going to fund that gap? Is it going to be is that public money that's going to fund it? Is it commercial money that's going to fund it? How's that going to happen?
there's a sort of long and short answer to your question. The long one would be better, but I don't think we've got time. The short one is that historically, if you go to a financial services firm and say, you want to know about systemic risk, uncertainty in climate change or whatever it is, don't you? Yes. How about giving us some money? And the short answer is they don't want to, because they can't actually see there's a likelihood of getting a result that makes sense, mostly because they haven't got the experience of having done it. I spoke to a guy from Barclays, head of research for Barclays a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I don't have any problem working in academia. We spent £1.5 million in the last couple of years. It's great, it's fantastic, I love it. But and everybody else in the room said they had a problem. The reason he loved it was he had the experience, but the point is he also had prepared to put some money in. But organisations like ours find a way of bridging that gap. So we have to sort of nurse the financial services sector to say, no, we can make this work for you. This is what we're going to do. What exactly do you want? You tell us what you want. We'll go and talk to the academic world. We'll come back in 2 weeks' time, and then we do the bit in the middle.
Yeah, but that might fund a few PhD students or postdocs, but it's not gonna create enough of a business that venture capitalists are going to want to invest in the companies that are in the middle, for example.
Well, I do disagree. I mean, we just got a large asset management firm that's about to invest several million in a research centre. I've got another organisation that's got about £500,000 to spend on a couple of projects. And I know £500,000 is not a ton of money, but it's a starting point. I've got somebody else with a couple of 100,000. So those are ones that I've got live right now. There's more out there, but I'm not saying we're going to get tons of. We're not going to replace the gap from the UK research councils overnight, but we can move in the right direction.
Well worth following up on, actually, because clearly there is a gap that needs to be filled, and the mechanisms for doing it presently aren't there. Matt, I think, had a question.
So actually, just sort of a couple of comments, really. And the first one, I think you said at the beginning of your talk that when you look, in the literature, you find that studies and data are, I think you said, incomplete, conflicting, and in the wrong format. And yeah, okay, welcome to our world. But I think one of the things that you mentioned about the IPCC is, of course, that the role of the IPCC is to synthesize those incomplete, conflicting studies which are in the wrong format. And I think I would refute the allegation that IPCC is somehow politically controlled, but I would accept that the timescales for IPCC are politically controlled. And the reason for that is because governments want updates. They want new syntheses of these, this vast amount of research which is going on, which they can't make sense of.
Well, and I accept it, but I think the IPCC, I was thinking about it over lunch. I mean, when I make my control is the wrong word. But I think it's being influenced by, if you like, but to some degree. I mean, would it exist if the governments would want it? Do you think?
No. I mean, it was conceived by governments, but the reason it was conceived was exactly the issue that you identified, which was, how do you make sense of all this research which is out there, to produce a synthesis.
Yeah, that's fair. I think looking at it from the outside, I think the IPCC is doing. It's a horrible job to do, actually. I think it's a tremendously difficult job to do.
You're telling me.
But therefore, it's almost bound. It's bound to be imperfect, right? But that's the trouble. It's trying to do too much too quick, possibly. But but on the other hand, it probably has to. So.
Maybe a more general comment about filling this gap. There is one thing that everyone has to understand about the academic community. Is that the biggest capital for an academic researcher is his credibility, his professional credibility. And this credibility is being built by peer-reviewed papers and so on. And the thing is that when a scientist expresses himself by being interviewed by The Sun or when you appear on TV, you are really putting your credibility at risk because you are playing a game where the rules are different than in the academia. And I think it's a reason why, you were mentioning that scientists being appalled by the fact that not everyone was knowing what he was doing. But the thing is that when scientists become really reluctant to appear on TV and debate against some notorious skeptic person. And so, I'm not sure where I'm leading to, but the point is that to fill the gap, you really have to employ people that play another game than the academic game, and that really are able to communicate between the two parts, which essentially means you need separate funding. And I really agree with what was being said there. You can't possibly expect the scientists to make all the way because you are essentially asking them to destroy their own capital by doing that.
It's very interesting. There's a US film that's come out about the financial crisis, and in it, and I've forgotten the name actually, but in it, they tried to interview lots of bankers, and none of them, not one single one, accepted to be interviewed. The only people that would accept to be interviewed were the academics supporting the bankers, and they all said yes, or a lot of them said yes, and unfortunately, didn't come out very well as a result of it. Because the people who were interviewing them knew how to get information that sounded good for a film, So it doesn't have to necessarily be. I mean, nobody would expect a fantastic researcher in some element of climate or hydrology or whatever it is to also be a massively good communicator. But I think that it's tough if you can't, as a community, find people or mechanisms to be able to deliver this, then I think there's a problem, and there will always be a problem. Now, the other thing is that there are plenty of places in academia that are doing work on communication. So this doesn't have to be going over the wall into the sort of business community. Talk to some people in other departments who are dealing with communication and say, how do we communicate this? And communicating risk, I think, is incredibly challenging, and there's some interesting research being done on it. But I'm not really saying that you, in your research, have to do it, or anybody else in this room, but somebody needs to, I think, because otherwise there's this problem and the barrier will remain.
We've got time just for one more, I think. Sorry, Eric, can you take it over? Coffee, that's Peter, your hand went up fractionally quicker.
In industries like financial services, companies make money by having information that their competitors don't have to get a competitive advantage. Yet as academics, our wish is to push our information out as widely as possible to everybody. It seems to me there's a tension there between having additional information that means you can make money, and everybody having the information, which means nobody makes any more money. Would you like to comment?
The asymmetry of information angle is clearly that's what people look for. They look for the asymmetry and then work out a way of doing it. After saying that, though, the degree of asymmetry tends to go narrow over time. So ultimately, everybody's very happy. I mean, there are several projects that I'm working on where people are saying, look, we're all doing the same thing. We're all looking at the same information and trying to spend money getting research to be able to do it. Why don't we just pool that money, spend 10% of it on, collectively doing it, and then make the differentiation how we use that information. So fundamentally, I think is, at the moment, the world insurance and reinsurance community uses, 60% of it use the same model on frequency and severity of natural catastrophes. Right? So they're all using that same information, and they don't like it, but for various reasons, that's the way it works. Okay, so you can absolutely go, here is lots of information, or here are lots of models, and we just got, accepting, of course, you can confuse people by giving them too many results. But ultimately, it's not a problem, trying to sort of put out information to a wide community. That this open access CAT model, catastrophe model project, is exactly trying to do that. It will be free to use. I mean, the idea is it'll be free for any academic. You can download it. You can then plug in modules, and then you can run it like you're an insurance company. That's the idea, and everybody will have access to it, free, unless you want to license your module.
Thank you, Dickie. We need to move on now to the second talk. So thank you again.